these are your notes on cell organelles. Oops. All right, so we'll start with the cell membrane. We will talk about the cell membrane in more detail later. I'm just going to give you a quick overview here. The cell membrane is mostly made of lipid, and it does control what enters and leaves the cell. So it's kind of like a boundary. If you want to think about kind of an analogy for all of this, and like the cell as a small town or a city or a school, the cell membrane would kind of be like the borders, perhaps, of that district or that city. It does provide some protection and support, but its main job is to separate what's on the inside of the cell from what's on the outside of the cell. We'll talk about its composition a little bit more later, but for now, it is made of something called a phospholipid bilayer. Bi just means two, so there are two of these phospholipid layers. If you look down here towards the bottom, you'll see what looks like a little ghost or a ball with two strings on it. That's a phospholipid. It's basically two lipids, two fatty acid chains, with a phosphate group attached. And that's what most of this membrane is made of. There are proteins in this membrane. There's cholesterol in this membrane, which is also a lipid. And we'll talk all about this in more detail later. And a general kind of overarching model to view the cell membrane is called the fluid mosaic model. Fluid because all of these things move, they're not stuck there. And mosaic because, like in art, you have all these different pieces. So you have all these phospholipids, you have all these proteins, you have all these cholesterols. So we call it the fluid mosaic model. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. This is like mission control. I guess if you had an analogy, it would be like City Hall, perhaps. Maybe it's like the principal's office in a school. It's kind of like the control center. This contains the DNA. And again, DNA, we'll talk more about this later, but this is kind of the source of information to make proteins. All the chromosomes you have are all in the nucleus. They're all made of DNA as well. The nucleus itself has a membrane. In fact, most of the organelles that we're going to talk about today also have their own membrane. And by the way, RNA is made in the nucleus, which is the other nucleic acid. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So this is where the cell takes glucose, which is a monosaccharide, and it essentially burns it to produce ATP. ATP is the cell's energy source, and we'll talk more about ATP later. It's actually a modified nucleotide, believe it or not. And this is just called cell respiration. So the process of making energy for the body, making ATP, is called cell respiration. And we will cover that in more detail later. Mitochondria have a double membrane. We'll talk about why they have that double membrane later also. It's called the endosymbiosis theory, and it also explains why chloroplasts have a double membrane. But all cells have mitochondria, at least cells that are eukaryotic. We'll talk about that too. That means not bacteria. So if you're not a bacterial cell, basically, you will have mitochondria. Plants, animals, fungi, and protista all have mitochondria. All right, here's the other double membrane organelle, the chloroplast, found in plants. These and some other organisms, some protista, they like Euglena, a little single-celled organism that lives in pond water, capture the energy from sunlight and convert it to chemical energy sugars, right? So they're actually going to build glucose. This process is called photosynthesis. You guys are probably quite familiar with it from middle school. Chloroplasts contain a pigment called chlorophyll that absorbs different wavelength colors of light. You can think of them like little solar power plants, whereas maybe like the mitochondria is more like a factory, perhaps, or like a electrical plant. This is like a solar electrical plant, a solar power plant. Ribosomes make proteins, and all cells have ribosomes. Animal, plant, fungus, protista, and all the bacterial kingdoms have ribosomes. Everything needs to make proteins, right? These do not have a membrane. There is no membrane around a ribosome. So this is an exception to your organelles having membranes. This is the one that does not. Again, this is where you're going to make proteins, so you're going to link amino acids together, right? The dehydration synthesis reactions that we've been talking about before in the last unit are going to happen at the ribosome. Ribosomes can be in the cytoplasm, or they can be attached to what's called the rough ER. We'll do that in a second. And they make proteins. And we'll spend more time on how that all works later as well. All right, so the rough ER is a system of membranes that are all folded up on each other. There are two types, smooth and rough. The ones that are rough because they have ribosomes on them. The ones that are smooth because they don't have ribosomes on them. But you can think of them as an area for proteins to mature. They can be a system of canals that things can move through to get to the different parts of the cell. And let's look at these in more detail. So on the left you have the rough ER. This is where ribosomes will attach, and they will basically let the protein out into the rough ER so that the protein can mature and become a fully functioning, fully folded protein. It's like a safe space for the baby protein to become an adult protein, more or less. And that's what happens in the rough ER. The smooth ER, because it does not have ribosomes, really has nothing to do with helping proteins grow up or mature or fold. It actually will assemble lipids, and it also can detoxify, especially in your liver cells. So liver cells in particular have quite a lot of smooth ER. It's also the site of lipid synthesis. All right, the Golgi body is kind of like the post office in this analogy. It's like UPS. You're going to package, you're going to sort, you're going to tag proteins and other things that need to be moved throughout the cell. It is also a system of membranes, and it kind of looks like the Wi-Fi signal. If you're looking at an image of a cell and you're like, well, how do I tell if it's the Golgi or the smooth ER or the rough ER? It looks like a Wi-Fi signal, whereas the ER does not. Lysosomes are small little, almost like miniature cells. They just look like a little teeny cell inside the bigger cell. They have kind of their own little cytoplasm because that cytoplasm has very, very low pH, because lysosomes basically just digest macromolecules or broken cell parts. They have a lot of digestive enzymes, right, which are just proteins that run chemical reactions, and they're kind of like a garbage disposal, maybe like the one in your sink, or like a cleanup crew, perhaps. Right? So those are lysosomes. These are only present in animal cells, by the way. Plant cells do not have these. Vacuoles are like storage closets, right? So they're going to store water, salts, minerals, carbohydrates, anything that the cell needs to keep a reservoir of. If you're an animal cell, you'll have many, many small vacuoles. And again, these do kind of look like little cells in terms of like their shape and their structure. They're obviously not cells, they're organelles. But plants, on the other hand, are going to have one giant vacuole right in the middle of the cell filled with water, and we'll talk more about the function of that in plants later. Just as a quick kind of overview, it just helps the plant cell keep its shape. Like if a plant cell is not having enough water in its vacuole, it's going to wilt. You're not going to have internal pressure pushing up against the cell wall, which we'll talk about next. And this is why plants will wilt when they need water, because they don't have the water pressure pushing up against the cell wall, which helps the plant cells stay rigid. Cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is mostly water, and it is the space in between all of the organelles and all of the kind of intercellular space. This is where all of your chemical reactions occur. People think that the cytoplasm is just kind of like a gel that just sits there and does nothing, but it actually is one of the most important organelles cells have. This is where all the chemical reactions happen. It does have to maintain a constant pH because enzymes that are in there are specific to a pH environment, too acidic and they denature, too basic and they denature. All the dissolved products, oxygen, carbon dioxide, ATP, nucleotides, amino acids are all floating around in the cytoplasm. It's incredibly important and it is mostly made of water. Therefore, organisms are mostly made of water. Centrioles are only in animal cells. They are going to make something called spindle fibers. Spindle fibers are just proteins that pull chromosomes apart. So these are only in animal cells, and they only are made and constructed during cell division. When the animal cell is not dividing, the cell will break down these centrioles and recycle the pieces. And we'll talk more about centrioles when we talk about mitosis and meiosis. Cytoskeleton is kind of like the structural girders of a building, like the beams that you might see as a building is first going up. They provide structural support for the cell, and they also provide a space, like a little highway, for things to move around the cell on. They're kind of like a little roadway as well. They are made of proteins, and there are different types. You have microtubules, microfilaments, intermediate filaments. You don't have to really know that. But you do need to know that they are a structural support. They're kind of like your bone skeleton in your body. I mean, the word skeleton is right there in the word. And it is in the cytoplasm. So you have a skeleton in the cytoplasm that supports the cell and provides a surface for a little highway system for things to move around. All right, is this it is. Okay, so this is the last one. It's in bacterial cells, and it's in plant cells, and it's in fungal cells. So the only cells that don't have this are some protist cells, so some protista, little single-celled organisms, and animal cells don't have this either. So cell walls support and protect the cell, again, in plants, fungus, and bacteria. In plants, at least, they're made of cellulose. Remember, cellulose is a structural carbohydrate. It's made of thousands and thousands and billions of glucoses all linked together. Wood, paper, all of these plant products are made of cellulose. If you've ever heard of the word fiber, when you eat food, it's like, oh, it's high in fiber, that's just cellulose. So fiber is actually just plant cellulose, and we don't digest it very well. You actually don't have enzymes to digest cellulose. So this is one of the things you poop out when you eat a salad, is all of the cell wall. You don't really digest the cell wall. Again, this is found in plants as well as fungus and bacteria. Right. So those were your cell organelle notes, a brief overview, and I hope this helped.